I suppose that human beings, looking at it, would say that arms are the most dangerous things that a dictator, a tyrant needs to fear. But in fact, no. It is when people decide they want to be free. Once they have made up their minds to that, there's nothing that will stop them.
The United Democratic Front was a non-violent movement protesting South African apartheid, the segregation of white South Africans from non-white Africans. Apartheid, meaning apartness in Afrikaans, was a systemized form of discrimination against the non-white majority in South Africa that began in the 1920s and was made an official policy in 1948. However, racial prejudice and the legacy of white supremacy began long before then, in the 17th century, when Dutch explorers first colonized the region. Although the movement played a huge role in striking down apartheid, current race relations in South Africa are still influenced by deep-rooted prejudice. Racial groups, defined as European, Indian, colored, and African, were separated. Europeans and non-whites could not marry. Different races were forced to live in different residential areas, with European men and women given the freedom to live and work as they please, and Black Africans confined to racially zoned townships and forced to carry passbooks. Bantu peoples received an education that only taught the skills needed to take on menial jobs for whites, and could not attend white universities. To protect their power from the majority non-white population, which played a huge foundational role in the South African economy, white South African leaders created an arbitrary judicial system that reinforced apartheid legislation. In 1948, the African National Congress, which had represented the interests of African and colored South Africans for nearly 30 years, began an official campaign of civil disobedience based on Gandhi's nonviolent protests. However, the campaign resulted in failure, and later bans on protests forced the ANC underground. The young militant leaders, including Nelson Mandela, abandoned nonviolent strategy in 1961 and were imprisoned in 1964 as a result. In the 1970s, a group led by Black activist Steve Biko called Black Consciousness promoted a pan-African spirit and nonviolence to resist the white supremacist government. The group influenced Black students across the country, including a young man named Popo Molefe, who would later become the secretary of the United Democratic Front, to begin to participate in the civil disobedience movement. But the students were largely unorganized and unconnected. It was not until 1983, when constitutional changes proposed a parliament with only white, colored, and Indian representatives, a tricameral parliament, that more than 600 youth, civic, and religious affiliate organizations against apartheid came together to form a united front. Systems of regional organization and public support from religious leaders like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, winner of the 1984 Nobel Peace Prize, supported the rise of the UDF. Although Nelson Mandela and other exiled ANC leaders remained symbols of apartheid resistance, and the UDF proudly touted a connection to the ANC, the organization had its own identity and began campaigns to raise awareness and resistance, starting with the tricameral system.
The United Democratic Front, along with its affiliates, promoted rent boycotts, school protests, public demonstrations, campaigns, worker stayaways, and a larger boycott of the tricameral system to show exactly how much economic, political, and social power they had when united. However, what made the United Democratic Front successful was that, contrary to its predecessor, the organization focused primarily on the common South African and inclusivity. The United Democratic Front focused on lower-class Black South Africans, for they unquestionably paid higher rent payments and bills relative to white South Africans. By relating the greater issue to their daily experiences, the UDF was able to make the movement more personal to those members of the lower class. The UDF informed them about the reality of their political situation and the methods with which Black South Africans could come together to combat and defeat a racist system that benefited from their oppression. In order to continue reaching working class communities, the UDF allied with hundreds of political, labor, youth, sports, religious, and community-based organizations in order to widen their range of influence, including the Islamic Council of South Africa, Federation of South African Women, Congress of South African Students, simply name a few. By collaborating with these organizations, the members of the UDF could publicize their message both at home and abroad that brought the injustice to the forefront and encouraged people to join their efforts. Not only did the UDF use powerful, reputable leaders from these organizations to spread the message of equity, but also youthful, trained activists who were skilled in interacting with the masses, educating current and possible future supporters, and organizing actions of resistance and protest. In churches, for example, activists would try to form discussion groups on local levels in order to initiate the conversation with the goal to educate people and teach them the first principles of resistance politics. By doing so, the United Democratic Front was able to break the silence within the Black South African community about an issue that, when kept silent, did more harm than good. This also encouraged regular South Africans to take to the streets and begin their own protests against not only businesses and government, but also local officials that supported an apartheid government. After gaining a large support base, the government would be forced to acknowledge the fact that they could not continue oppressing the majority, who deserved the very equal and same fundamental rights, citizenship, and treatment as any other South African, regardless of their race. The United Democratic Front made sure not to exclude any demographic in order to make the movement more collaborative and effective, something that past anti-apartheid South African movements had not done. Even though it was expected that white South Africans would be reluctant to engage in this movement, the UDF's focus on a nation rather than on a race made it easier for white South Africans to remain open-minded and willing to listen. The UDF's promotion of non-racial democracies helped them be seen as less of a threat, since race, class, status, and gender in non-racial democracies would be seen as identifiers rather than reasons for oppression. Rather than white South Africans becoming defensive, they became more sympathetic, eventually encouraging increased involvement of white liberals in UDF's protest initiatives. By including white allies, the UDF was able to have their voices heard more easily rather than being shut down for being too aggressive or belligerent, making the movement even more effective. By reaching a larger audience, the UDF was successful in initiating a progressive dismantling of an oppressive government through the use of mass-based resistance, alliances, and nonviolent protests. The UDF's support of nonviolence tactics merely strengthened the movement due to the government's militant response against a regime that wanted to remain legitimate. Nonviolence was refuted with repression. The regime arrested leaders that instigated boycotts, thousands were imprisoned without trial, media was censored, and various forms of protest were banned. However, Lawrence du Plessis, chief of police and intelligence in the Eastern Cape of the 80s, commented, "It had no effect. There was really nothing we could do." The government could not use military force against nonviolent civilians, whose civil disobedience placed enormous pressure on a country as a whole, as it would only fuel the protesters' fire.
The nonviolent movement was largely successful all across South Africa. From 1990 to 1996, the apartheid policy was finally struck down, and South Africa's first universal suffrage election was held in 1994, resulting in Nelson Mandela being elected the first black South African president in history. But things weren't simply smooth sailing. During this time, racial tensions persisted between conservative whites and blacks who demanded equality in practice, not just in legislation. To this day, race relations still suffer due to this dark, tragic history.
In South Africa, I grew up as a white Afrikaner, and it was very interesting to see how apartheid's after effects still is very much alive and well in South Africa. Not so much on racial grounds. I would say that the segregation between people or races is mainly because of poverty. So it's interesting coming to a country like the United States. I would actually say that the racial tension in the United States is higher than it is back home. When crime happens back home, it's not because of race, or that's not the motive of the crime. It's always because of the money. So we really have a big deficit between the rich and the poor, and it's a problem that our current government has not been able to fix yet. So
the ANC is given much credit for the UDF's efforts, but even Nelson Mandela admitted that without the contributions from the UDF, apartheid would have ended much later. And during his time in prison, he held no opposition whatsoever towards the UDF's efforts. Though there is currently equality by law in South Africa, in reality, a minority of white South Africans still hold the majority of the power in the country. In conclusion, the United Democratic Front's nonviolent movement resisting apartheid achieved its goals of stopping legalized oppression and instituting a democratic government in South Africa. The UDF's success was in large due to its organization and mass mobilization strategies, as well as its focus on inclusivity. However, despite the huge positive change instigated by the UDF, South Africa still has a long way to go in dealing with racial inequality. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they will never get there.